After weeks of being trapped in a brutal meat grinder of ridges, escarpments, and open killing fields, on April 24, 1945, American forces finally broke through the outer Shuri line. But just as the tide began to turn, the Japanese vanished, falling back to the next ring of prepared fortified positions within the Shuri defense zone, ready to make the invaders pay for every foot of ground, all over again. But before we dive deeper into the events on Okinawa, here is a quick word from today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Supremacy, World War III, the ultimate military strategy game set in the late 20th and 21st century. This game isn't just about combat, it's about grand strategy, where you don't just build armies, you command them in real-time tactical combat on a beautifully detailed isometric world map with more than 100 real countries. Week-long matches, giving you the chance to craft strategies, manage your national war economy, and research over 250 technologies. With more than 350 modern weapon systems at your disposal, from stealth strike fighters and attack helicopters to nuclear submarines and weapons of mass destruction, every decision carries real consequences for your people and your economy. You can form alliances with other players, coordinate attacks, or go head-to-head in direct PvP. And here's the exciting news. Supremacy just got even bigger. The brand new Officers Update introduces powerful personality-driven leaders who bring unique strengths and tactical bonuses to your forces. While in Season 18, you'll face an entirely new threat, the Evolved Undead. And the best part? Supremacy World War III is free to play on PC and mobile. And for the next 30 days only, everyone who downloads the game using the link in the description or pinned comment will get an exclusive elite bomber worth $25 to dominate the skies from day one. The hard-fought capture of Kakuzu, Nishibaru, Tanabaru, and Skyline Ridges brought a brief and bitter relief to the exhausted men of Major General John R. Hodges' 24th Corps. Yet their blood-soaked advance had virtually just begun. Ahead of them lay the true core of the Shuri line, anchored to a new series of ridges and escarpments, fortified with an even denser web of caves, tunnels, and concealed firing positions. Each ridge would be another fortress, and each advance promised another brutal fight. After advancing roughly a kilometer on April 24th, Hodge ordered a halt. His divisions, battered and thinned by weeks of attrition, were given time to rest, regroup, and prepare for a new general attack, scheduled for April 26th. In the meantime, he directed all units to send patrols forward to probe for the new Japanese line. What they found, or rather what they didn't, offered little comfort. The Japanese were gone, but not far. This stark reality that his troops were about to enter another killing zone, combined with the heavy toll of weeks of relentless combat, and the knowledge that the Japanese remained deeply entrenched and unlikely to yield without a bitter fight, prompted General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., commander of the U.S. 10th Army on Okinawa, to initiate a major troop redeployment to reinforce the main battle line in the south. Thus, on April 24th, Buckner ordered Major General Pedro A. Del Val's 1st Marine Division to relieve the 27th Division along the west coast and temporarily join 24 Corps, while once pulled from the line, the 27th was to take garrison duty in the central and northern sectors, where it would also relieve the 6th Marine Division. In turn, the 6th Marine Division would move south to serve as the 10th Army's reserve, ready to be engaged in the western sector if necessary. At the same time, the 77th Infantry Division, though not entirely fresh, having fought at Karama Reto and on Ie Shima, with 3 of its battalions still on occupation duty on outlying islands, was brought to Okinawa to relieve the severely depleted 96th Division in the center. The 7th Division, meanwhile, was to remain on the line and was to rotate with the 96th after its 10-day rest. However, before any of these troop movements could take effect, it was once again the 7th and 96th Divisions that would bear the full weight of the April 26th assault. While American forces regrouped, in his headquarters, deep beneath Shuri Castle, General Mitsuru Ushijima, commander of the 32nd Japanese Army, was forging plans of his own. By late April, he had concluded that the threat of an amphibious landing in southern Okinawa had passed, and that the main American thrust was clearly coming from the north, while, despite 3 weeks of relentless combat, the core of his army remained largely intact. On April 23rd, Ushijima ordered the 24th Division to move forward and reinforce the battered 62nd Division, which had borne the heaviest fighting since the start of the battle. The 24th took over responsibility for the eastern sector of the Shuri defensive line, allowing the 62nd to concentrate its remaining strength in the center and west. 3 days later, on April 26th, he moved to further strengthen his position by deploying the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade to a new position west of Shuri and north of Naha, behind the remnants of the 62nd, ready to counter any American breakthrough on the west coast. Still, Ushijima did not abandon the southern portion of the island entirely. Between 2,000 and 3,000 troops were left behind to conduct delaying actions in the event of another American landing. With both sides bracing for what lay ahead, the brutal struggle for Okinawa was about to enter a new and even bloodier chapter. At 7 a.m. on April 26th, following a half-hour artillery preparation, the 24th Corps launched its renewed assault. In the western sector, the 27th Infantry Division pressed forward, though isolated Japanese resistance remained stubborn in the rugged terrain of the so-called Item Pocket. Yet despite this, the 165th Regiment, spearheaded by its 1st and 3rd Battalions, pushed through, and by day's end they had managed to make substantial gains, reaching the northern edge of Makinato Airfield, with patrols pushing as far south as Kuan Inlet. To their left, in the center of the 27th Division's front, the 106th Regiment initially made swift progress east of the village of Yafusu. However, upon meeting stiff resistance, their advance stalled, and the village was not fully secured until the following day. Meanwhile, the 105th Regiment, having regrouped after the brutal battles for the Pinnacles, advanced through the village of Nakama against moderate opposition before establishing a defensive line on its outskirts. Despite these initial advances, the overextended and exhausted 27th Division had little left to give. For the next several days, it made virtually no offensive effort until it was finally relieved by the 1st Marine Division in late April and early May. On the extreme left of the 24th Corps line, the 7th Division renewed its offensive along the eastern shore. On April 25th, the 17th Regiment passed through the lines of the 184th and took the lead for the next day's assault. At dawn on April 26th, advancing in conjunction with the 32nd Regiment on its left, which pushed south along the eastern coastline, the 17th quickly came under intense Japanese fire. As the regiment moved forward, it walked straight into a carefully prepared killing ground. Japanese mortars and machine guns, carefully pre-sighted, unleashed a storm of fire from positions atop Kochi Ridge, which lay between the villages of Kochi and Onaga, and even more formidable was Conical Hill, a dominating height that overlooked the coastline and guarded the approaches toward Shuri. These two heavily fortified strongholds, as well as the broken ridgelines and rising terrain beyond, stretching southwest toward the Shuri, would soon become the main focus of the 7th Division's bitter struggle in the days ahead. As usual, the 96th Division in the center was assigned the most challenging objective. This time, the division faced perhaps the most formidable terrain feature on all of Okinawa, the Maida escarpment. Situated at the eastern end of the Urusei-Mura escarpment and named after the village of Maida, just over its crest, this position would become infamous under several names. Hill 196, as it was referred to in the official reports, the big escarpment among American troops, and most famously, Hacksaw Ridge. Across most of the division's sector, the escarpment rose in sheer cliffs, in some places more than 120 meters high, and to reach it, the Americans would have to climb to attack, leaving behind their artillery, tanks, and assault guns, which could not follow them up the steep slope. The assault, therefore, would have to be a frontal attack by infantry alone and carried out under murderous fire. To make matters even worse, the Maida escarpment was just as heavily fortified as the Kakazu and Nishibaru ridges, with bunkers, weapon pits, a vast tunnel system, and interconnected caves, some of them large enough to hold hundreds of men at one time. Passageways connected the caves to each other and to the crest above. Throughout were placed hidden gun ports and firing positions carved into the rock. Even the village of Maida, behind the ridge, had been transformed into a fortress, with its concrete buildings converted into bunkers. And behind that were Japanese artillery, mortars, and machine gun emplacements, all zeroed into the crest of Hacksaw Ridge. At the far eastern edge of the escarpment stood a towering rock formation known as Needle Rock, a massive, isolated outcrop that marked the start of a complex ridge system. Just beyond it, a 185-meter saddle dipped gently toward Hill 150. Another saddle, stretching 365 meters farther east, led to Hill 152, the point where the high ground abruptly turned southwest, forming a natural corner where the high ground of the Uraso-Mura escarpment formation turns at right angles to the southwest, around which the main road curved toward Shuri. For the assault on the Maida escarpment, the 96th Division's commander, Major General James L. Bradley, deployed the 381st Regiment directly opposite the cliff face, while the 383rd Regiment took the position on its left flank. Throughout most of April 25th, the division's officers meticulously studied this formidable terrain, trying to pinpoint all known or suspected Japanese positions hidden within its heights. With the first light of April 26th, the assault on the Maida escarpment began under the cover of a massive preparatory bombardment, as 1,616 artillery rounds, combined with heavy airstrikes, pounded the Japanese positions. Initially, the advance seemed promising. Infantrymen of the 381st Regiment moved steadily up the sheer forward slope, facing little resistance. But as soon as the assault companies of the 381st Regiment clambered to the top of the escarpment, within minutes they suffered 18 casualties. Across the entire regiment's front, the same pattern repeated. As soon as the leading men reached the top, they were met by a withering storm of machine gun and rifle fire, cutting down those who had gained a foothold and turning the top of the escarpment into an untenable killing ground, halting the 381st advance in its tracks. Here on the Maida escarpment, the Japanese had perfected the art of reverse slope defense, fully abandoning any positions along the ridgetop, not because it could not be defended, but because any troops there would be exposed to American artillery and mortar fire. Instead, they patiently waited until American troops appeared over the lip of the ridge before unleashing their fire and then launching a counterattack. Thus, while the forward face of the cliff was relatively easy to ascend, the crest and especially the reverse slope immediately behind it were forbidden, deadly ground that no attacker could hold. And yet it was there, where the Japanese troops lay hidden, concealed from direct bombardment and invisible until the last moment, that the real battle for Hacksaw Ridge would be fought. While the 381st Regiment stalled at the base of the escarpment, farther east, there briefly seemed to be a chance of a breakthrough. There, supported by tanks, elements of the 383rd Regiment pushed forward and managed to seize the crests of hills 150 and 152. But in the face of determined resistance, their advance ground to a halt by late morning, and the men dug in to hold their gains, spending the remainder of the day locating and eliminating Japanese weapon positions in the area. This American gain posed a serious threat to the integrity of the entire Maida sector, and in response, on April 26th, General Ushijima issued urgent orders, directing the 32nd Regiment of the 24th Division to hurry north and reinforce the line. By April 28th, the fresh regiment had taken up positions in the center, between the 22nd Regiment of the 24th Division on the east and the battered remnants of the 62nd Division, which now held the western third of the line. Building on the limited gains of the previous day, and convinced this sector offered the only real chance of a breakthrough, on April 27th, the 383rd Regiment, this time reinforced by the 1st Battalion of the 381st Regiment, renewed the attack. Supported by tanks, they advanced through the saddle between hills 150 and 152 at the corner of the Maida escarpment, where the high ground turned sharply southwest. The combined force pushed as far as the southern edge of Maida village before being stopped by intense mortar and machine gun fire. Elsewhere along the front, the rest of the 381st Regiment fought desperately to gain a foothold on the crest of the escarpment. Again and again, assault teams reached the top, only to be driven back by heavy Japanese fire, and by day's end, the crest remained an untenable killing ground where no further advance was possible. This frustrating lack of progress at the base of the Maida escarpment forced the 381st's commander, Colonel Michael E. Halloran, to attempt a bold flanking move by striking from a different direction. In an attempt to break the deadlock on April 28th, he ordered elements of his 3rd Battalion to move through the 27th Division's zone to the west and attack southeast through Nakama towards so-called Apartment House, a large concrete school building used as barracks and turned into a center of Japanese defense in the area between the villages of Nakama and Maida. After a brutal half-hour of hand-to-hand fighting, the assault was thrown back with heavy losses, and the survivors withdrew under the cover of smoke. By this time, weeks of heavy fighting had taken a staggering toll. Some companies of the battered 381st Regiment were already down to barely 24 men. In fact, companies K and I, both greatly reduced, were merged into a single company with a combined strength of only 70 men, while some platoons in other companies were down to as few as 5 or 6 men. Meanwhile, the progress made by the 383rd Regiment quickly drew a fierce Japanese response. On April 29th, with freshly arrived troops, they counterattacked in waves, sparking savage close-quarters fighting. Time and again, the Americans held their ground, repelling every assault. Yet despite counterattacks, continuous infiltration attempts, and punishing artillery and mortar fire, the 383rd pushed deeper along the road that ran between the eastern end of the Urusei-Mura escarpment and the village of Kochi, reaching the point from which American guns could fire directly on Shuri Castle, thought to house General Ushijima's headquarters. That night, yet another Japanese counterattack was launched, only to be torn apart by the defending Americans. On the same day, fresh American units began to rotate into the line. The 77th Division, which had come ashore on Okinawa on April 27th, after completing mop-up operations on Aishima, relieved the exhausted 381st Regiment around the Maida escarpment. The following morning, the 306th Regiment replaced the 383rd on the division's left flank, and by midday on April 30th, Major General Andrew D. Bruce, the 77th Division's commander, had assumed control of the entire former 96th Division sector of the 24th Corps front. By the month's end, the toll on the 96th Division was devastating. The 381st Regiment had been reduced to barely 40% of its combat strength, suffering 1,021 casualties, 536 of them in just 4 days of fighting at the Maida escarpment. Altogether, since landing on Okinawa, the division had suffered 2,504 battle casualties, including 353 killed in action, before being pulled out of the line for rest and rehabilitation. In the meantime, on the flanks of the 96th Division, the other 2 divisions of the 24th Corps were enduring ordeals of their own. On the Corps' eastern flank, the 7th Division had ground to a costly standstill. In front of Hacksaw Ridge, the 17th Infantry Regiment launched repeated assaults, only for each to collapse under withering fire. By April 29th, the offensive had completely stalled, yielding no gains but leaving behind heavy casualties inflicted not only by Japanese defenders but also by tragic incidents of friendly fire. The terrain itself compounded the disaster. Broken and abrupt, it prevented effective coordination between assault units. Worse still, every movement of the 17th Regiment was perfectly visible to Japanese forward observers. Each time the Americans attempted a push, dozens of Japanese mortars rained down on the threatened sector, denying any possibility of advance. Even when the 7th Division managed modest gains after securing the villages of Kochi and Onaga on April 28th, the 17th still could not secure a foothold on Hacksaw Ridge. The next day brought no relief. Every attempt to move more than a handful of men into the shattered terrain around Kochi, Onaga, and Kuhazu was instantly met with a deadly concentration of small arms fire, mortars, and artillery, turning the approaches into a death trap. While the 17th Regiment struggled in vain to seize Hacksaw Ridge, the 32nd Regiment on its left flank held back its advance, as pushing forward would have left the regiment dangerously exposed to Japanese fire. Yet the 32nd did not stand idle. Instead of frontal attacks, it sent strong combat patrols probing west and south of Yonabaru airfield. By late April, the 32nd tried to ease pressure at Kochi by striking Japanese positions to the southeast. Supported by armored flamethrowers, It pushed into the village of Kuhazu, but the accompanying infantry was quickly halted under a storm of concentrated mortar fire. On April 30th, General Archibald Arnold, the 7th Division's commander, frustrated by the 17th Regiment's lack of progress at Hacksaw Ridge, shifted the division's main effort toward the left flank. That day, backed by heavy artillery and close air support, the 1st Battalion of the 32nd Regiment launched a determined assault, advancing more than a kilometer and seizing the ridges southwest of Kuhazu. That night, however, the battalion endured relentless counterattacks and infiltration attempts, delaying its relief by the 184th Regiment, which finally replaced the exhausted 32nd by the end of May 1st. The struggle for Hacksaw Ridge itself dragged on into the early days of May, and despite repeated efforts, the gains remained minimal. Every assault was shattered by massive concentrations of artillery and mortar fire, backed up by small arms and machine gun fire, consistently driving the attackers back time and again. On the western flank, the 27th Division continued its slow push south. On April 28th, the 165th Infantry Regiment, supported by tanks and assault guns, advanced through heavy resistance, knocking out several Japanese pillboxes along the way and completing the capture of Makinato Airfield. Elsewhere in the division's sector, progress was minimal, as the rest of the 27th was hampered by stubborn Japanese defenders holding positions along the southern slopes of the Uraso-Mura escarpment. Early the next morning, on April 29th, the last 34 survivors of the Item Pocket launched a frenzied banzai charge against the lines held by Company K of the 165th Regiment's 3rd Battalion, which cut them down in moments, ending 9 days of fanatical resistance from this notorious strongpoint. That same day, the remainder of the 165th pressed south and east of Makinato Airfield, but was soon halted by Japanese defenders deeply entrenched in mine-protected positions scattered across the surrounding hills and ridges. On April 30th at 10 a.m., the 27th Division halted its forward progress and began to disengage as fresh Marine units from the 1st Marine Division started to move into the line. The relief proceeded over the next 2 days, with the 1st Marines relieving the 165th Regiment along the west coast on April 30th, and by May 1st, the 5th Marines had taken over the sectors held by the 105th and 106th Regiments. At 2 p.m. on May 1st, Major General Pedro del Valle, commander of the 1st Marine Division, formally assumed responsibility for the sector, as his division was temporarily attached to the 24th Army Corps. For the 27th Division, the relief marked the end of a punishing 12 days on the line. Since launching its assault on April 19th, the division had sustained staggering 2,661 battle casualties, including 316 of them killed in action. In less than 2 weeks, its ranks had been so badly depleted that had losses continued at the same pace, the end of the campaign would have found every man who had originally landed on Okinawa buried or hospitalized. As the 27th Division staggered out of the line, the 1st Marines were moving in, about to face their first real test on Okinawa. Since the unopposed landings on L Day, the 1st Marine Division had largely remained in the rear, defending the Central Plain and dealing mainly with the Okinawan civilians and refugees along the roads. But that was about to change. After spending April 30th relieving the 27th Division and strengthening its positions, the Marines were about to get a harsh introduction to the kind of fighting that awaited them in the south. In an attempt to continue where the 165th Regiment had left off, on May 1st, the 1st Marines advanced to expand the perimeter around Makinato Airfield. Supported by tanks, the 3rd Battalion pressed toward Miyagusuku village east of the airfield, only to march straight into a Japanese trap amid the smoking ruins. A storm of rifle and machine gun fire cut into the battalion, forcing it to withdraw with heavy losses. In a brutal introduction to the true nature of the campaign, Company K alone, which had been spearheading the assault, suffered 24 casualties. On May 2nd, a driving rain swept the battlefield, foreshadowing the weather to come, while Company K once again spearheaded another assault. Fighting their way through the shattered ruins of Miyagusuku, they reached a line of small hills roughly 250 meters south of the village, where at 8 p.m. they were ordered to dig in and hold. That night, the Japanese struck back with relentless infiltration attempts, sparking violent hand-to-hand clashes. Weapons clogged with mud, leaving the Marines with only 2 working rifles, a single bar, and their grenades. Others wielded jammed rifles as clubs or fixed bayonets to fight in the dark. By dawn, Company K had held its ground, but only after suffering 42 additional casualties and enduring what many would later recall as their grimmest night of the campaign. Elsewhere, the rest of the 1st Marine Division fared little better. On the right flank, the 1st Battalion of the 1st Marines ran into equally fierce resistance as it pushed toward Kuan Inlet. To the left, 3 battalions of the 5th Marines advanced abreast, only to be thrown back almost immediately by withering frontal and flanking fire. In just 2 days of combat, by the evening of May 2nd, the division had already suffered 298 casualties, including 54 killed, 233 wounded, and 11 missing. The days that followed brought no relief. Each new attack gained only a few hundred meters, paid for in blood. While the Marines struggled along the west coast, the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 307th Regiment from the 77th Division were thrown straight into the fight. Upon their arrival on April 29th, the 1st and 3rd Battalions immediately attempted to gain a foothold on the Maida escarpment, only to be welcomed by the same furious wall of devastating fire that had already bloodied the 381st. At first, the crest seemed eerily quiet. The men reached the bare top and looked out across the plateau without spotting a single Japanese soldier. Then, without warning, the silence shattered. Grenades, machine gun bursts, and mortar rounds erupted from hidden bunkers, pillboxes, and underground positions, unleashing what survivors later described as all hell rolled into one. Under the sheer weight of fire, the assault battalions were forced back to their starting positions. Yet this was only the beginning of the 307th's ordeal. It would take 5 days of brutal fighting to gain control of their part of the escarpment, including Needle Rock. The men of the 1st Battalion were driven off the crest and from Needle Rock 9 times before they managed to hold them for good. During the night of April 30th, in an attempt to improve their position and make it easier to scale the vertical cliffs and bring ammunition and supplies to the ridgetop, the 1st Battalion of the 307th brought 4 scaling ladders and 5 cargo nets, borrowed from the Navy, to Hacksaw Ridge. The next day, under the cover of every available supporting weapon the regiment could muster, the men of the 1st Battalion began climbing. At the eastern end of the escarpment, Company A led the climb, and every man who mounted the ladders and reached the crest was either killed or wounded, while others who managed to reach the top were hurled back down by a fierce Japanese counterattack, leaving this attempt no more successful than the many other assaults that had come before. Meanwhile, on the 77th Division's right flank, the 3rd Battalion of the 307th Regiment pushed through Nakama village, and from there it struck eastward toward the apartment house and barracks complex. Though the building itself was undefended, it lay under such intense fire that the troops were forced to dig in just short of it. The 2nd Battalion soon followed, but little more could they do except entrench alongside them, as the volume and accuracy of Japanese fire made any further progress impossible. By May 2nd, the unconquerable Hacksaw Ridge still held firm, and no amount of bravery, heavy artillery, or bombs seemed able to break it, so the Americans turned to a different approach. First, they fired more than 200 phosphorus shells at the cliff top from heavy 4.2-inch chemical mortars, whose high plunging trajectory proved far more effective in the rough mountainous terrain than conventional howitzers. Afterwards, under this cover, the 1st Battalion, broken into small infantry assault teams, armed with grenades and satchel charges, scrambled up the escarpment, blasting any Japanese positions they encountered. Some even reached the southern slope before their ammunition ran out, and they were forced to run back to safety. Yet, when the 1st Battalion withdrew, one man stayed behind alongside plenty of wounded. That man was Private First Class Desmond Doss, a medic from Company B. Though injured himself, he refused to leave Hacksaw Ridge. Braving artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire, Doss, the last surviving aid man in his company, spent hours alone atop the escarpment. One by one, he treated the wounded, dragged them to the cliff's edge, and lowered them to safety below. By night's end, he had saved some 75 of his fellow soldiers. It was only the first of his several acts of extraordinary heroism on Okinawa that would ultimately earn him the Medal of Honor, making him the first conscientious objector ever to receive America's highest military decoration. By May 3rd, sheer determination finally began to pay off. On the right flank, the 2nd Battalion pushed beyond the apartment house, partially cutting off Hacksaw's eastern end from the rear and beginning the grueling task of clearing caves and pillboxes along the reverse slope. At the same time, the 1st Battalion fought its way across the crest in brutal close-quarters combat. For hours, the fight devolved into a deadly grenade-tossing duel, until by late afternoon, the top of the escarpment was finally in American hands, and the battle rolled onto the reverse slope. By nightfall, the 307th Infantry Regiment had all but encircled Hacksaw. The 1st Battalion held firm on the crest, blasting and sealing Japanese emplacements to consolidate its precarious grip on the high ground. The 2nd Battalion secured positions to the south, while the 3rd anchored the western flank. Yet the Japanese were far from finished. From hidden caves and bunkers, they mounted fierce resistance, launching repeated platoon and company-sized counterattacks in desperate attempts to claw back the escarpment. The next day, after a night spent clinging to the bare plateau under the heaviest artillery barrage the 77th Division had yet endured on Okinawa, the 1st Battalion resumed the fight to clear Hacksaw's summit. Armed with crates of grenades, satchel charges, and cans of gasoline hauled up over Navy cargo nets, the assault companies lined up along the escarpment's edge and worked methodically forward, hurling grenades, blasting caves and pillboxes, and sealing shaft openings one by one. By late afternoon, the crest was finally secured, and the 1st and 2nd Battalions had linked up on the far side of Hacksaw. For this achievement, the 1st Battalion of the 307th Infantry Regiment, together with Companies E and I, and the 1st Platoons of Companies C and H, was awarded a Presidential Unit Citation. It praised them for assaulting, capturing, and securing the escarpment, a heavily fortified coral rock fortress, which was the key to the famed Japanese Shuri defensive position on Okinawa during the period from April 30th to May 5th, 1945, and making possible a general advance by all elements of the command. Throughout this ordeal, the 307th was supported on its left by the 306th Regiment, but on May 4th, the 306th had troubles of its own. All along the 24th Corps front, a new crucial set of events was beginning to unfold. In just over a week of combat, before Hacksaw Ridge was finally declared secured on May 7th, the 1st Battalion of the 307th Regiment, which had borne the brunt of the fighting, had seen no fewer than 8 company commanders wounded. Of the roughly 800 men who stormed the Maida escarpment on April 29th, only 324 were still standing when the nightmarish battle came to an end. And once again, big thanks to Supremacy World War III for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. If you download the game using the link in the video description or pinned comment, you'll receive a free Elite Bomber worth $25. This offer is only available for the next 30 days. Don't wait, download Supremacy World War III and start your conquest today.